Hi everyone, this is Samantha Rose Hill, and this is week 2 of Eichmann in Jerusalem. So I'm going to walk us through Hannah Arendt's argument about Eichmann, and then we'll take a look at a couple of the passages. So what does justice, so we have two primary questions. Justice and judgment. Justice and judgment. So what does justice look like in terms of Eichmann for Eichmann? What does justice look like for the trial? Does the court really confront Eichmann? And then in the final pages, we're going to get Hannah Arendt's judgment of Eichmann. And just as a bracket, Hannah Arendt's final work, The Life of the Mind, was conceived as part 2 of The Human Condition. And it was also conceived as a response to the response she received for Eichmann in Jerusalem. And she wanted to use the text on willing and judging in part to think about the question of whether or not it's possible to prevent evil doing in the world. And she argues that if it is possible to prevent evil doing in the world, then that must happen somewhere in the individual in their thinking process. And she says, so we cannot know for certain, but if there is some kind of stopgap mechanism there that can prevent evil, then it has to happen in thinking. And so we're going to get Hannah Arendt's judgment of Eichmann, and that's going to speak to these concepts of thinking and willing, and how it is that we fine-tune that inner instrument of judgment that allows us to act in the face of evil. So Hannah Arendt rejects the claim that Eichmann was just a hapless cog, innocent of murder, which he claims. And she rejects the Israeli court's response also to Eichmann's wrongdoing. So she's going to give us a different framework for thinking about Eichmann's crimes, and she's going to talk about what Eichmann did in terms of being a question of war and a question of war crimes outside of the law. And for her, it's going to be a question of war crimes outside of the law in relationship to, as a matter of, for her, what is the foundation of the human condition, the fact that we have to share the world together. So a lot of political philosophers have a kind of fundamental understanding of what makes us human. For Aristotle, we have the idea that, man is a social animal. For Karl Marx, there's the idea that we have the ability to use the labor power of our hands to transform nature into objects and make things. For Hannah Arendt, we appeared here. We appeared here. None of us asked to appear here. We all appeared here differently from one another. And we appeared in a world that existed before us. And we will leave a world that will continue to exist after us. And I say that, and I hear a kind of inner Charlie Chaplin laughing in my head, as, for the first time in my life, at least, nuclear war doesn't seem impossible. But if, the Earth doesn't need us. Anyway, bad jokes are not going to stop today. So Arendt argues that the question for the Israeli court was one not of punishing Eichmann, right? You committed these crimes, therefore you must serve this sentence, but rather it was a term that was important for her, that it's a question of reconciliation. That it was a question of reconciliation. And so she argues that the Israeli judges should have deferred the case ultimately to another international body and judged Eichmann politically, as opposed to what she sees to be a kind of show trial trying to judge him legally. So in there, we get a distinction between a political judgment, which is where she's going to take us, and the legal judgment, which she doesn't think is capable of addressing the magnitude of the crimes. And this isn't, I mean, this is just an interesting question to think about. Are there certain crimes that exist outside the legal system? So in the final pages, Arendt is going to offer us what she thinks the judges should have said when they sentenced Eichmann to death. She's going to give us her own judgment. She's putting herself in that position of judging. So Arendt argues that Eichmann has to die, but for the non-legal judgment that and instead she argues that he has to die for the political judgment, which is that his existence made sharing the world with others impossible, that he violated the fundamental tenet of the human condition for her, which is plurality. So one of the things that she's trying to do here is to build a case to look for a way to open up an extra legal judgment that's not grounded in law, but in political principles. And so for her, Eichmann has to die because his actions cannot be reconciled to sharing the world in common. Are there some actions that cannot be reconciled to this fundamental political principle of plurality, of what it means to share the world in common? So today we might think about something like a hate crime, something that is politically motivated. Before we turned on recording, we were talking a little bit about the assassination of a Democrat last week. We have an example of a politically motivated hate crime, for example, to maybe hold as an object in our contemporary world as well. So for Arendt, justice is a matter of judgment. And she was concerned, as we talked a bit about last week, with the way in which post-war trials were carrying out judgments as show trials. And she's arguing that they claim justice, that they're doing the work of justice on one hand, but they're actually failing to legally try the crimes on the other, because the judgment has already been made, right? There is a presumption of guilt. And it's the presumption of guilt that makes it a show trial for her. It's the presumption of guilt that makes it a show trial for her. And, we can think about her and whether or not that, assumed position of naivete, expecting to see Eichmann held accountable for each of his terrible crimes, was, what kind of positioning that was. I'm going to sneeze. Okay. So what she argues instead is that the trial was meant to provide a record. And it does, right? That the trial is meant to create a human record. And so weeks pass on end, she says, where nobody even talks about Eichmann. But what we get is a kind of stage for storytelling. And she says that the trials were also flawed because that they were meant to try the individuals through evidence and facts. But Eichmann had not violated any law. And this is where that question of whether or not there are crimes that exist outside the legal system becomes important and interesting for Arendt. What Eichmann did was legal, technically speaking. And this is he was following orders, right? This is what she means by that. This is part of the banality. It was legal. He was following laws that should have never been made, though, right? And this is the problem of political judgment. What happens when the moral norms so thoroughly collapse that old edict, thou shalt not murder, becomes thou shalt murder? So he's following laws that should have never been made. Commandment, not edict. he commits, so he's committing, he commits political crimes by following unjust laws. And she talks about his consciousness, and she talks about how he had, this kind of inner personality of the bureaucrat of wanting to do the right thing, to follow the laws. But if he's guilty of anything, he's guilty of following these inhumane laws. And so we need a new framework for thinking about this distinction between legal crimes and political crimes when laws are used in order to allow crime, in order to facilitate it, in order to do it. She doesn't, for Arendt, Eichmann's not a monster. There are no monsters. She uses the language of a clown, right? He was a clown. He was a buffoon. And I think a clown came up last week in our conversation about Eichmann too, and thinking about Trump. And so he was not a monster. He was a clown. And he had, for Arendt, this was illustrated in those famous passages around his use of cliches. He had a kind of inability to speak directly to the topic at hand. He had a kind of inability, she says, to think from the standpoint of the other. That's how she's going to ultimately define the banality of evil. And so we have this question of language, we have this question of communication, and how it is that Eichmann thought about what it is that he had done and how he presents what he had done and says he had not done in the court. And she says, and it was like talking to a brick wall, is how she describes it. And I think I always think of this, kind of phenomenon where you're talking to someone and they're not listening, but they like pick up on one word in a sentence you say, and they have a kind of pre-recorded track. And so then they just, take that word and then go. That's what she's describing here. That kind of knocking one's head up against the wall. There's no real correspondence in communication. And so she calls this a form of unthinking evil, because it's not responsive. It's not in this kind of correspondence. It's a kind of unthinking evil. And so let's just hold that here for a second and go back to the first. I want to go back to the first thing I said. So for Arendt, the negative claim is, if it's possible to prevent evil in the world, then the difference between those who go along with evil and those who commit evil is that those who resist choose to think. And she's going to say very clearly, not so much here, but in the work on thinking, that all people are capable of thinking. All human beings are capable of making this choice. And that's the ethical question. That is the ethical question of judgment. So she's trying to get her hands around Eichmann's unthinking evil, his inability to imagine the world from the other. And she was, I think the word astounded comes to mind. That's always the impression I get. She was kind of astounded by this kind of clownish quality, that he liked to boast, he liked to brag, and he never had that self-reflective form of critical judgment where he asked himself about what he had done. He bragged about it. He didn't reflectively think about it. And I think that's really what she's describing here when she talks about imagining the world from the perspective of the other, and not just from the self's own kind of position. So he performs his duty and he brags about his duty. She's frustrated. She's frustrated with the court. and she's frustrated